My mother said it at the reception table, 30 minutes into my sister's wedding. Not whispered. Not pulled aside in a hallway. At the table, with four of my mother's friends sitting close enough to hear, while I was mid-sentence explaining what I did for a living to the woman next to me. My mother leaned over, placed her hand on my arm, and said, "Megan, please. You're embarrassing yourself." I stopped talking. The woman next to me, Patricia, a family friend I had known since I was 12, looked uncomfortable. The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet when someone has said something that everyone heard and nobody wants to acknowledge. I picked up my water glass. I said nothing. And 40 minutes later, the groom walked across the reception hall, past his own wedding guests, straight toward me, and said my name in the way people say your name when they know exactly who you are and can't quite believe you're in the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what I was explaining when my mother stopped me. Because that's where the whole story lives. I'm a structural engineer. Specifically, I work in forensic structural assessment, which means when a building fails or shows signs of failure, or needs to be evaluated after a disaster, I'm one of the people who gets called to understand what happened and why. It's precise, technical, high-stakes work. The kind of work where being wrong has consequences that go beyond a bad quarterly report. I had been doing it for 9 years. I was good at it. 3 months before my sister's wedding, I had led the assessment team on a bridge evaluation that had made regional news, a pedestrian bridge that had shown significant stress fractures, that we had flagged for emergency closure, and that had been condemned and scheduled for full replacement. The story had run in several outlets. My name had been in 2 of them. I want to give you a picture of what that assessment actually involved, because I think it matters for understanding what my mother was interrupting when she told me I was embarrassing myself. The bridge had been showing subtle signs for months, micro-cracking patterns that a casual inspection would miss, load distribution anomalies that only showed up under specific traffic conditions. The city's routine maintenance team had flagged it for review. My firm was brought in to do the forensic assessment. We spent 3 weeks on it. I personally spent over 100 hours on the analysis, reviewing the original construction documentation, running stress models, taking physical samples, building a failure probability timeline that could withstand legal scrutiny because in forensic assessment, your findings are often introduced as evidence and they have to hold. The final report was 60 pages. It recommended immediate closure. The bridge was closed within 48 hours of submission. 6 months later, when the demolition team began the work, they found 2 load-bearing elements that had been compromised at a structural level invisible to non-specialist examination. The assessment had been right. The bridge, if it had remained open under normal traffic load, would likely have experienced a partial collapse event within 18 months. My name was on that report. My analysis was the foundation of the decision to close it. My mother knew I was an engineer. She had always known that. What she had never done, in 9 years, was ask what kind or what it meant, or what I actually did on any given day. To her, engineer was a category, not a career. It produced a comfortable salary and a stable life, and was otherwise not particularly interesting to discuss at dinner tables. So when Patricia asked me what I did, and I started explaining, not the full version, just the short one, bridges and structural assessments and the work that followed visible failures, my mother's reaction was not about the content. It was about the performance. About the fact that I was talking at length about technical things in a social setting, and which she had decided was boring or self-important, or simply not the right kind of conversation for a wedding reception. You're embarrassing yourself. I had heard versions of that my whole life. Different words, same meaning. You are too much of what you are. Dial it down. Fit the room. The room, that day, was my sister Ashley's wedding. And the groom was a man named Daniel Reyes. And Daniel Reyes knew exactly who I was. Ashley and Daniel had been together for 3 years before the wedding. I had met Daniel twice, once at a brief family dinner 18 months earlier, and once at an engagement party where the noise level made real conversation impossible. Both times we had exchanged the kind of pleasantries that future in-laws exchange when neither party has been given the context to know each other properly. But what I did not know, what I had no reason to know, was what Daniel did for a living. Ashley had mentioned he worked in construction. My mother had mentioned he was in development. Neither of those descriptions had prompted me to ask further, because the descriptions were vague enough that asking further seemed impolite, and I had been in enough family settings to know that deep professional conversations were not what those settings were designed for. Daniel Reyes was not in construction in the general sense. Daniel Reyes was the founder and principal of a mid-sized civil engineering and development firm that had, in the past 5 years, taken on increasingly complex infrastructure projects in our region. His firm had been a secondary contractor on 2 projects I was tangentially aware of through my own work. More significantly, his firm had been directly involved in a project that had been adjacent to the bridge assessment I had led 3 months earlier. Not the bridge itself, a related infrastructure corridor that our teams had coordinated on briefly during the evaluation period. He knew my name from that coordination. He had seen my assessment report. He had read it, not because he was required to, but because the findings had implications for his own firm's adjacent work. And Daniel Reyes was, by all accounts, the kind of person who read things carefully. He had not connected me to Ashley until he saw me at his own wedding reception. Here is what happened, in order. My mother said what she said. I went quiet. The table moved on. I spent the next 30 minutes doing what I had learned to do at family events, being present without being visible, engaged without being too much, careful in the way you are careful when you have been told, repeatedly and in various ways, that your natural volume is set slightly too high for the rooms your family occupies. I was talking to Patricia again, about something safer, her garden, her grandchildren, when I saw Daniel across the room. He was making his way through the reception hall in that deliberate way that grooms move through their own receptions, stopping at tables, accepting congratulations, managing the particular choreography of being the center of a room full of people who all want a piece of your time. He stopped at our table. He greeted my mother, who smiled and said something warm and social. He greeted the other women at the table, and then he reached me, and he looked at me for 1 second with the expression of someone running a quick cross-reference in their head, and then he said, "You're Megan Calloway." Not a question, a recognition. I said, "I am." He said, "You led the River Street assessment." I said, "Yes." He extended his hand, not the perfunctory handshake of a groom moving through his reception, but the deliberate handshake of a professional meeting a peer he respects. He said, "Your report on the stress fracture patterns was the most thorough piece of structural analysis I've read in 5 years. We completely restructured our approach to the corridor project because of it." The table had gone quiet again, a different kind of quiet this time. I said, "That's good to hear." And the corridor implications weren't obvious from the surface data. He said, "No, they weren't, which is why it mattered that someone caught them." He paused. Then he said something that made several people at the table shift in their seats. He said, "The work you did on that bridge almost certainly prevented a catastrophic failure event. I've been in this industry for 15 years. I've seen what happens when the forensic assessment gets it wrong, or when no one calls it in time. Your report was what made the difference." He said it clearly, not performing it, stating it. The way professionals speak when they are making a factual assessment rather than paying a social compliment. My mother was sitting 2 feet away. She did not say anything. Daniel continued. Ashley never mentioned her sister was in forensic structural work, when I had no idea we'd been in the same professional orbit. I said, "Small field." He said, "Small field. And you're one of the best in it, based on what I've read." He looked like he had more to say and was editing himself for the occasion. "We'll have to talk properly. This is not the venue, but I have questions." I said, "Congratulations on the wedding." He grinned. "Thank you for coming. I mean that more than the standard version." And he moved on to the next table. Daniel moved on to the next table after a few more minutes. The professional conversation ended and the wedding continued, and Ashley came over to say hello, and the evening kept moving the way evenings do. But the table was different after that. Patricia asked me a question, a real one, not polite small talk, about what a forensic structural assessment actually involved. I told her. She listened. One of the other women asked a follow-up. I answered it. My mother sat through this without intervening. She did not say I was embarrassing anyone. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't feel in that moment. I did not feel triumphant. I was not sitting there enjoying the reversal. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated than that. The specific sadness of a moment that should not have been necessary. Daniel's recognition should not have been the thing that gave me permission to occupy the table. My own presence should have been enough. My own life. My own work. My own 9 years of doing something serious and doing it well. That should have been enough. In my own family. At my sister's wedding. It wasn't. But Daniel's recognition was. And I sat with that. Quietly. Moot while the evening went on. My mother came to find me near the end of the reception. I was standing near the edge of the venue, away from the main room, getting a few minutes of quiet before the final portion of the evening. She walked over and stood next to me, and for a moment we both looked out at the room without speaking. Then she said, "I didn't know Daniel knew your work." I said, "Neither did I." She said, "He seems to think very highly of it." I said, "He's a serious person. His opinion is worth something." She said, "I've never heard you explain what you do the way you were explaining it to Patricia." I said, "I was explaining it because Patricia asked." A pause. Then, "I should have asked." I turned to look at her. She was still looking at the room, not at me. Her profile was familiar and also, in that moment, slightly unfamiliar. Like seeing someone you've known your whole life in different light. I said, "Yes, you should have." She said, "What I said earlier was, I was worried you were going on too long. I didn't think about how it sounded." I said, "It sounded like you were embarrassed by me." She said, "I wasn't. I'm not." A pause. "I don't always understand what you do. That's not the same as being embarrassed by it." I said, "Not understanding and not asking are two different things. You've never asked." She looked at me then, and in her face I saw something I recognized from the rare occasions when my mother was genuinely sitting with something rather than managing around it. A kind of still, unguarded quality. The face of a person who is hearing something they know is true and is deciding in real time whether to acknowledge it. And she said, "You're right. I haven't." That was all. No speech, no tearful apology, just 3 words that cost her something to say and meant something to me to hear. I said, "Okay." We stood there for another minute. Then we went back inside together. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Ashley the following week. She called me on a Sunday, which she rarely did. We had the kind of sibling relationship that operated mostly through texts and the occasional group family call, which is what happens when 2 people grow up in the same house but in different versions of it and never quite find the language to bridge the gap. She said, "Daniel told me what he said to you at the reception." I said, "What did he say about it?" She said, "He said he couldn't believe he was married into a family that didn't know who you were professionally. He said he's going to embarrass me at dinner parties for years by telling the story of meeting his sister-in-law at his own wedding reception." I laughed. Genuinely. She said, "Megan, I'm sorry." I said, "For what specifically?" She said, "For not knowing. I've been telling people my sister is an engineer for 9 years, and I couldn't have told you what that meant for more than 2 sentences. I didn't ask. I just, I accepted the version of you that Mom presented and didn't look underneath it." I said, "What version did Mom present?" She thought about it. Then, capable, serious, a little hard to talk to. Someone who was fine and didn't need much. I said, "That's a very efficient way to make someone invisible." She said, "I know. I'm sorry." She said it the way you say something when you mean it and know it isn't enough, and are saying it anyway, because not saying it would be worse. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I wasn't looking for a perfect resolution. I was looking for honesty, and she was being honest, and that was where things had to start. She said, "Daniel wants to have you over for dinner. He has about 40 questions about the River Street project." I said, "Tell him I'll bring the full report." She laughed. We talked for another 20 minutes. About her honeymoon, about Daniel's work, about what the next year looked like for both of us. It was the longest real conversation we had had in years, maybe ever. My mother and I have been talking differently since the wedding. Not transformed. I want to be honest about that, because transformation stories are usually cleaner than reality. But differently. She asks questions now. Not always the right questions. Not always with the full patience the answers require. But she asks, and she listens for longer than she used to before redirecting. She came to visit me 2 months after the wedding. I showed her my office. I showed her the wall where I pin the structural drawings of whatever project I'm currently working on, a visual habit I've had since graduate school, the way some people keep calendars, because I think better when I can see the whole shape of something. She stood in front of the drawings for a long time. She said, "How do you know where to look for the problem?" I said, "Experience, and knowing what failure looks like before it happens." She said, "You've always been like that, even when you were a kid. You could see the thing that was about to go wrong before anyone else noticed it." I said, "You never told me that." She said, "No, I didn't." She looked at the drawings for another moment. Then she said, "I think I spent a lot of years being afraid of the way you saw things, because you saw things that were uncomfortable to see. And I thought, if I paid too much attention to it, you'd turn that on me." I said, "I wasn't turning anything on anyone. I was just looking at what was there." She said, "I know that now." That conversation, the wall of structural drawings, the afternoon light, my mother finally saying a true thing about why she had looked away. That is the one I carry. Not the wedding. Not Daniel's recognition. Not the reversal at the table. This one, because it was the one where she wasn't responding to external evidence. She was just, finally, imperfectly, genuinely, looking at me. I want to say something to anyone who has been told, in one form or another, that the way they occupy a room is too much, that their expertise is boring, that their passion is embarrassing, that the thing they have spent years building is something to be managed rather than celebrated. Your capability is not a liability. Your depth is not a problem. The fact that you know things, real things, hard-won things, things that took years to understand, is not something you should be apologizing for in rooms full of people who never asked to understand them. The person who made you feel like it was a liability was working from incomplete information. They had a story about you that did not include the evidence. And sometimes, not always, not automatically, but sometimes, when the evidence arrives in a form too clear to dismiss, the story gets updated. Daniel Reyes walking across a reception hall and saying my name changed something in that room. Not because I needed his validation, I didn't, but because the gap between how my family saw me and what I actually was had finally become visible to everyone at the table simultaneously, and visible gaps are harder to maintain than invisible ones. I did not plan that moment. I did not engineer it. I just showed up, and I was who I was, and the truth that had always been there finally had a witness. That's all it takes sometimes. One witness, one moment, one person who looks at you and says your name the way it deserves to be said. With recognition, with respect, with the particular warmth of someone who knows what the work actually cost and what it was worth. You are that person to someone. And one day, in a room you didn't expect, they will say your name. Be ready. The bridge we assessed is being replaced this year. Construction started in March. I drove past the site on my way to a project meeting last week and stopped for a moment on the overpass to look at the work below. The new supports going in, the careful sequence of it, the particular beauty of infrastructure being built correctly. I thought about my mother standing in front of my office wall, asking how you know where to look for the problem. I thought about Daniel crossing a reception hall to say my name. I thought about Ashley calling on a Sunday and saying, "I'm sorry," in the way that means something. And I thought about the version of me that sat at that table 30 minutes before any of that happened, holding a water glass, saying nothing, doing what I had learned to do in rooms where I was told I was too much. That version of me is not entirely gone. Old habits don't disappear. But she has less room than she used to, because the truth has been said now. In a reception hall, at a dinner table, in an office with structural drawings on the wall. The truth has been said and witnessed, and it is harder to unsay a truth once it has been spoken in the right room. I know where to look for the problem. I always did. So tell me, has someone ever made you feel like the truest version of yourself was something to be ashamed of, and then watched, in silence, while the world disagreed? Because here is what I want you to know. You were never embarrassing. You were just in the wrong room. And the right room was always one moment away. 3 days after the wedding, I got an email from Daniel's firm. A formal inquiry, professional, specific, asking whether my firm would be available to consult on a pre-construction structural risk assessment for a large mixed-use development his company was planning. The project was significant, the kind of project that generates meaningful revenue and meaningful professional relationships. He had not mentioned it at the wedding. He had gone home from his own wedding reception and drafted a professional inquiry to the sister-in-law he had just met, because that is who Daniel Reyes turned out to be. Someone who, when he encountered serious work, he responded to it seriously. I accepted the inquiry. We had the first call the following week. He was, as I had suspected from the handshake, exactly the kind of professional who made those calls productive, specific, well-prepared, genuinely curious about the technical dimensions. Toward the end of the call, he said, "I have to ask, at the reception, what was happening at that table before I came over?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The energy was off. You were quiet in a way that didn't match the 30 seconds I watched you talking before I introduced myself." Engineers notice things. It is an occupational habit that extends past the professional. I said, "My mother had just told me I was embarrassing myself." A pause. Ish then. "For talking about your work? For talking about my work?" He said, "I see." I said, "She didn't mean it the way it sounds. She doesn't know what I do. She never asked." He said, "She knows now." I said, "She knows now." He said, "For what it's worth. In 15 years of industry dinners and project meetings and professional conferences, I have not once thought, this person is too passionate about their field. I have thought that about 0 people. Ever." I said, "That's a useful data point." He said, Ashley is going to hear this story for the rest of her life, by the way. I want you to know that. I laughed. He laughed. We got back to the project. My mother called me a few days after that call. She had spoken to Ashley, who had spoken to Daniel, and the professional inquiry had gotten back to her the way family information moves. Circuitously, eventually, always. She said, "Daniel's firm contacted you." I said, "Yes." She said, "For a project." I said, "Yes." She said, "A big one," Ashley said. I said, "Reasonably significant, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about what I said at the reception, about you embarrassing yourself." I said, "Okay." She said, "It was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I said it, and I said it anyway because I don't know exactly why. Because it was a reflex. Because I have spent so many years trying to manage how things look in rooms like that, and you were doing something that felt unmanageable to me. Not because it was bad. Because I didn't understand it and I couldn't control the impression it made." I said, "That's honest." She said, "What Daniel said to you, what he said in front of those people, I've been thinking about it, about the fact that you have been doing work of that level for 9 years and I didn't know. That's not your fault. You tried to tell me. I didn't listen well enough." I said, "No, you didn't." She said, "I want to do better at that. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to." I said, "Asking is a good start." She said, "Then tell me about the new project, Daniel's project. What does it involve?" I told her. She listened for 14 minutes without redirecting, asked 2 questions, got one of the answers wrong in her follow-up, and I corrected her, and she accepted the correction without defensiveness. It was a start. The specific kind of start that might actually go somewhere. There is something I have been sitting with since the wedding that I want to share, because I think it is the truest thing I have learned from all of this. Capability does not protect you from being overlooked. In fact, in certain family systems, capability is the very reason you get overlooked. Because capable people are assumed to need less, to be fine, to not require the particular attention that is lavished on the ones who struggle visibly. I had been capable for 9 years. I had built a career that had real consequences in the real world. Bridges that stayed closed because my analysis said they should. Assessments that prevented failures that would have hurt people. I had done all of this quietly, without requiring my family to validate it, or without making their acknowledgement a condition of continuing. And that quiet capability had made me, in my family's eyes, invisible. Not maliciously, just automatically. The way infrastructure is invisible until something goes wrong. The wedding cracked that invisibility. Not because I arranged it. Not because I said something powerful or made a speech or confronted my mother over the embarrassing comment. Just because the truth was there, and Daniel walked across the room and named it in front of the people who most needed to hear it, and the gap between what my family believed about me and what I actually was became impossible to pretend wasn't there. I am still a structural engineer. I still do the same work I did before the wedding. My capability did not increase because Daniel recognized it. My worth did not change because my mother heard him say my name. What changed is simpler than that. What changed is that the story my family told about me, the one where I was capable and a little hard to talk to and fine, that story has been updated. Not replaced. Not reversed into some opposite story where I am suddenly celebrated at every table. Just updated, with evidence that was always there and is now impossible to ignore. That update is worth something. Not everything, but something. And sometimes something is exactly enough to start.